Hello and welcome. You're watching NewsX Deepdive, and after nearly a year of protracted, strenuous and politically sensitive negotiations, India had finally managed to broker what was being projected as a breakthrough trade deal with the United States. It was showcased as one of the most favorable arrangements Washington had offered any Indian neighbor. But that deal did not last very long. In a dramatic turn, the US Supreme Court struck down the very foundation on which the agreement rested. President Donald Trump's sweeping tariff powers. The court ruled that Trump had no authority to unilaterally impose and modify tariffs using emergency powers, asserting that such powers lie squarely with the US Congress. In effect, the tariffs that form the basis of the India-US interim trade deal were declared illegal. The ruling triggered political shockwaves in Washington, and for the Trump administration, tariffs were not just an economic tool but a core negotiating weapon. Losing that authority and leverage meant losing everything. But as President Trump made clear within hours, he had no intention of backing down. Abandoning the now outlawed route under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or IEEPA, Trump pivoted to a different and rarely used provision of US trade law, using Section 122 of the 1974 Trade Act. The president signed a proclamation imposing a temporary 10% tariff on all imports into the United States. Hours later, he raised it further to 15%, the maximum allowed under this provision. This law, it's important to note, allows such tariffs to remain in place for only about 150 days. Beyond that, the US administration would be required to seek explicit approval from Congress. In other words, this is a stopgap arrangement, legally permissible, but temporary. It is to be noted that sector-specific tariffs on steel, aluminium and automobiles remain in place. Now, what will be the effective tariff percent in Indian goods to US? Well, US tariffs on Indian goods have shifted from 26% to 50%, then down to 18%, and now fall under a 15% global tariff framework following the court ruling. But there is another caveat that is being pointed out. Trump has described this levy as a temporary import surcharge. That distinction matters. A surcharge, by definition, stacks on top of existing duties. It does not replace them. Does that mean that the 15% tariff is being added to the existing most favored nation, or MFN duties, which average around 3.5% across Indian exports? Put together, this brings the effective tariff burden on Indian goods to roughly 18.5%, marginally higher than 18% rate promised under the now derailed trade deal. In the coming days, it would be made more clear whether the effective tariff would be 15% or 18%. As of now, India and the United States have decided to reschedule the visit of their chief trade negotiators to Washington, which was set to begin on the 23rd of February. According to sources, both sides agreed that talks should resume only after assessing the implications of the Supreme Court ruling and the new tariff regime. This pause underscores the uncertainty that now clouds the bilateral trade relationship. Let's have a look at how everyone is reacting. Helios Capital founder Samir Arora hails the 15% tariffs by stating that if competitors face the same rate, India does not lose relative advantage. Australia's government, on the other hand, said it will examine all options after Trump imposed a 15% tariff on Australia as well. Australian Trade Minister Don Farrell said in a statement, "We have consistency and consistently advocated against these unjustified tariffs. We are working closely with our embassy in Washington to assess the implications and examine all options." German Chancellor Friedrich Merz has also made a statement saying that he would speak with European partners to shape a very clear European position and a joint response to Washington before his visit to the US capital in early March. In fact, there are reports suggesting that France's Trade Minister Nicolas Fourrissier is suggesting that EU could even use trade bazooka to counter these tariffs. Globally, the ruling has added fresh volatility to already fragile trade dynamics. In Washington, officials have acknowledged that the court's decision weakens America's negotiating hand. US businesses are preparing legal claims seeking refunds for tariffs already paid. Markets have reacted cautiously, factoring in policy instability rather than relief. China, meanwhile, is watching closely. Analysts say that the ruling gives Beijing a moral boost, but not necessarily a strategic one. With Trump already signaling alternative tariff paths, China is expected to tread carefully to avoid triggering a full-blown trade war ahead of high-level diplomatic engagements. For India, the message is stark. There is no longer just about tariff numbers or trade concessions. It's about the volatility of deal making in an era where domestic politics, courtrooms, and executive power collide. What was projected as a breakthrough deal now sits in a limbo, not because negotiations failed, but because the legal ground beneath them shifted. Both Washington operating on temporary fixes and stopgap measures, certainty, not access, has become a scarce commodity. We'll talk about this with our guest. Joining us on the platform is Mithali Nikore, economist. Mithali, let me pick your brain on what flip-flops are happening in the United States at this point in time. It's first of all, let's look at what does this do to the image of the American government. They look extremely vulnerable and volatile, and of course Donald Trump must be embarrassed that he's put his administration as well as the world in an unnecessary flux of tariff and trade negotiations, whereas the law in the United States did not permit it. How do you see this factor affecting India and the trade deal that we've had with the Americans?
So I think first of all, I'd like to say that thank you for having me on the show, but also that I don't think Donald Trump is embarrassed. I think when you look at the tone of the messages that he's posting on Truth Social, he seems to be combative, he seems to be aggressive, and he's not at all embarrassed. In fact, I don't think he has understood that he has done anything wrong or illegal in any way. I think he thinks that the Supreme Court is the one that is wrong, that they have gone against him, and that he was right all along, and which is why you see him come back with, using the Trade Act instead of the Emergency Economic Act. So very honestly, I think that this exact attitude of presidential overreach, which the Supreme Court pointed out very clearly in their judgment, is exactly the reason why global trade stands in the disarray that it does today. Because this man does not understand what is presidential overreach.
Okay, you're perhaps right that Donald Trump isn't embarrassed by anything. But the fact of the matter is that, so much effort is being put into these tariffs, by countries for no fault of theirs. So much energy is being spent, in dealing with these tantrums that Trump has pulled off. To me, it seems that he's gotten used to the billions that have come in terms of tariffs, and he just wants to continue with that influx.
Absolutely, you're 100% correct. I mean, a lot of countries, and I just find it so bizarre that countries from the global south, India is of course one of them, but we have so many countries which are far more lower in the income bracket, than India, who have dealt with this, who are dealing with this, who are dealing with massive job losses, real people whose lives have been impacted, whose incomes and livelihoods, whose health, whose education, entire lives would be impacted by this so negatively. And that's just because, as you rightly said, of the tantrums of one person and the outsized impact that the US has on the rest of the global economy. And this is why you see that in the last 6 months, countries like India and even regions like Europe have gone ahead and just focused on trade diversification, saying that, this kind of risk in terms of including the US in their value chains and having US as such a big market that everyone is dependent on is no longer a viable option. One needs to diversify and lessen the power of one single country and one single individual in trade supply chains.
Mithali, you're absolutely right. The other thing that has happened over here now is that people have started to talk about alternatives. The Americas is a big market for any country that relies on manufacturing and export. But the fact of the matter is that, within the time that Donald Trump has dedicated in plowing out these tariffs, the world order when it comes to trade and economics is shifting under his feet. And perhaps this is the biggest travesty that the American people, seem to be ignoring.
Absolutely. And I genuinely feel for the American people in this case, because a lot of what the US Treasury has collected as tariffs nearly 50 to 60% actually, as per some studies that have been done by European think tanks, has come out of the pockets of American consumers, not from the countries where tariffs were applied. At the end of the day, when you apply a tariff, which is basically a tax, it is shared between both the importer and the exporter. And in this case, the importer, that's the US, bore more than half of it in several commodities and value chains. So we actually saw this impact coming, on the US and on the US consumer. And that is why we see the amount of inflation that the US is going through today has been extremely high. It's almost reaching 5%. And for the US, 5 to 7% inflation is amongst the highest that they've ever experienced. And when you look at food inflation, particularly, the cost of living, the cost of everyday goods, that has gone up even more because Americans are used to cheap food, but they are not getting that anymore. The import costs have increased, and that's impacting their daily lives.
Mithali, appreciate you joining us. Thank you so much for your inputs and your perspective. We take a short break now. Be right back.